Hello, good evening. My name is Rachel Reesbeck, and I am the Education Director for the Virginia Living Museum. And I want to welcome you guys to our Naturally Speaking event. We're really excited to have our speaker come on the member preview of our native plant sale. So for those that came and joined us earlier this afternoon, thank you so much. If you have not had a chance to go to our plant sale, we highly encourage you to join us. It will be open this Saturday and Sunday, and then the last weekend of April from 9 to 4:30. So I actually met Dr. Stephen, who is our speaker tonight, because we have a really great program where we work with students at Christopher Newport University to come and do fellowships with us. And so I reached out a couple years ago to start recruiting students to come and help us with some conservation projects. And we've been very excited and lucky to have Jordan Goodridge with us this year. They have been working on really great projects surrounding our native plants as well as invasive species. And so I'm so excited to be able to bring Dr. Stephen in tonight to let you guys learn a little bit about plants and hopefully encourage you guys to garden like an ecologist. So I'm going to go ahead and turn it over to her. Thank you.
All right. Thank you guys for coming out, and thank you for coming online if you're online. I am excited to talk to you about plants because there are many exciting things about plants for us to talk about. I am going to start out with a few ways that plants are different than animals that it's important to keep in mind. Then we'll talk a little bit about plants and habitats, and I've got some slides of plants that grow in this area that are good natives to plant in your yard. And then we'll talk a little bit about plants and the way they interact with animals. So I usually say, ask questions whenever you want, but we're only going to, I'm only going to be up here 20, 25 minutes. So I will take questions at the end, but if you have a burning question, I'm not going to stop you because that's the way you learn. So I want to talk about plant growth form. And then I'm going to talk about photosynthesis because those are two really key things to understand about plants. Plants grow from multiple points. And you can see in this illustration, they've got little red dots on all the places where plants can make new organs, essentially. So roots come from root tips, and every root has the possibility to grow more root. Roots can branch and grow more roots. And then in the above ground part of the plant, every bud can expand to be a new shoot. So you can see, I think I can, yeah. Can you see my pointer? All right. So you can see this little axillary bud right here doing nothing. This shoot down here used to be an axillary bud, and it has now expanded into an entire shoot with more places to grow. So plants can grow in response to their environment. They can grow in one direction and kill off shoots in another direction. They grow their entire life. They don't grow to a certain size and stop, and they don't have a set body plan. So they can keep adding branches and limbs, and that makes them very different than animals. It means that you can propagate them asexually, which is harder to do with animals. And it means that they can be very responsive to their environment. And this is an example of those lateral buds in action. You can see these are starting to expand into buds. So when you're gardening, it's important to keep in mind that the plant's going to grow, right? It's going to get bigger. It's going to take up habitat. It's going to grow towards sunlight if it needs more sunlight. It's growing below the soil too. And we call the fancy words for this, if you want to sound smart, are indeterminate modular growth. So indeterminate means that it can keep growing throughout its lifetime. It's growing from a lot of points. And modular means that it has these repeating units. Plants are not super well integrated like you are, like your physiological system is. Plants often are semi-independent from branch to branch. And so that means that this plant, which is growing across the top of the sand here, each little spot where it's putting up a shoot is probably also putting down roots. And that means that if you severed the stem, you could have a whole independent separate plant. So it's got these little repeating modules. And those modules are important for asexual reproduction as well as additional growth. This allows it to sort of colonize new habitats too. So that's one thing that makes plants really interesting and unique. And then another is the fact that plants only need a few things from the environment to live. This is one of the things that I think is so cool about plants, is that they take air and water, very simple molecules. They need sunlight, they need some minerals from the soil, and they build plant out of it. So the bulk of a tree, the trunk of a tree, is mostly from air and water. It's like 5% minerals from the soil, but most of it's carbon dioxide that's been locked up through photosynthesis and turned into plant. So they're taking all these inorganic things and making big complex molecules. They're the basis of food chains because they're capturing that sunlight energy and turning it into chemical energy that then goes on into the ecosystem. So without plants as those primary producers, you've got no biological system. So they're that critical input point from the inorganic world to the organic world. And they do it with these really small molecules, which I think is super neat. So that light and that carbon dioxide are critical to plant survival. Carbon dioxide is in the air, pretty easy for plants to get. Light can really influence how a plant grows and where it likes to live. It's like light, I always say that plants are cued into light like you're cued into lunch when you're hungry, right? They know where that sunlight's coming from. They know what time of day it's going to be best. They grow towards that. They orient their leaves to maximize light capture. Like light is their energy source. So they're very cued into it and very adapted to get that sunlight. And plant species are adapted to particular light and water environments. So we have a cactus here, obviously adapted to a very dry environment. It has strategies to survive when water is low. Also a very sunny environment. And then our forest understory is a much shadier environment and probably not nearly as dry. There's a lot more moisture available to the plants in that habitat. So plants are adapted specifically for a set of sort of light and water parameters in their environment. And that's important to keep in mind when you're thinking about what you want to plant where in your yard. So I have this little sort of 2-axis spectrum here of places where things could be sunny, but maybe have sandy soil, which doesn't hold water well. So that's going to let the water move through. So that's going to be sort of a sunny, dry habitat. That's where our cactus would be happy. It's also possible to be dry and shady. This happens in sandy soil, but sometimes also underneath a tree. So the tree is creating a lot of shade, but then the tree is also sucking up a lot of moisture. So the things that live under it don't get an opportunity to get a lot of moisture. And then on the sunny end of the spectrum, if we have sunny, wet soils, depending on how wet the soil is, you might be in a marsh or something like that, you know, if it's truly very wet. And then if it's shady and damp, that's sort of another set of conditions that plants have to adapt to. So when you're thinking about your yard, you sort of think about the sorts of habitats that you have in your yard. This is the back of a dune. That's a very sunny, dry habitat. This is another dry habitat. These are pine forests, which are dry, but a little more shady in the forest understory. Sunny and wet could be a marsh, could also be not that wet and just be a good spot with sun and wet soil or damp soil. And then shady and damp is often sort of forest understory conditions. So you got to think about what's in your yard in terms of a microhabitat when you're thinking about what to plant. Think about how the sun travels across your yard. Plants tend to like morning sun more than afternoon sun, but afternoon sun still works. They like to, some plants like to have direct sun, but some plants actually benefit from having shade for part of the day. So pay attention to where the shade in your yard is. Think about where water collects when it rains. It could be that you have a low spot in your yard or a spot where all the gutters empty out into. That spot's going to be wetter. You might have other spots where it's dry underneath trees or in a spot that's very sunny. Also think about where you're able to water, where you can drag the hose to, and also whether or not you want to drag the hose out there. So if you can't get the hose there, you got to think about something that doesn't need a lot of water. And then also what your soil is like, whether your soil is holding water well, or if it's draining and the water percolates through. Oh, and I put a picture of the native plants for Southeast Virginia guide. This is a fantastic guide. It's available free as a PDF online, and you can also buy it if you can find it for $8 or something like that. It is chock full of information on what likes to grow where, what you should plant in a rain garden, what you should plant in deep shade, and it's all natives, and it's specifically for the Hampton Roads region. So it's really tailored for the kind of habitats we live in. So if you don't have it, I recommend it. Okay, I want to go through a few slides of plants I like, plants that are native to the area, and plants that grow well in those little yard micro habitats. So sunny but dry. Sundial lupin is gorgeous and can handle pretty crappy soils. It does, it doesn't mind some bad soils. Spotted bee balm is really nice. Columbine is one of my favorites. Columbine is blooming right now, and you can buy it at the plant sale. So that's a good one for drier habitats with some sun. It doesn't need full sun all day. And grass leaf blazing star is really nice. Trumpet creeper borders on weed. It's a vine. It can grow quite happily with very little attention. But if you have some place where you would like a big draping vine, it's nice, and it's hummingbird pollinated. So you might see more hummingbirds in your yard. Plants for sunny spots that are a little more moist. Golden ragwort is blooming right now. It's gorgeous. I love golden ragwort. It has such a pretty color. And then blue-eyed grass is good for someplace where you want low plants, you want a little bit of ground cover. And it does look a lot like grass, except when it's blooming. Beautyberry is a shrub with berries that the birds love. You got to make sure you're getting the native beautyberry, but it grows really well and has good fruits. And calico aster blooms in the fall. It's also kind of weedy, so it's not too hard to grow. Plants for wet soils in sun. I sort of have wet to wetter in this picture, set of pictures. Sensitive fern grows really well where soils are wet, grows really happily in the sun, but also can handle some shade. Swamp rose mallow is good if your wet soil is also a little bit salty. And it's native, but it has these giant hibiscus flowers, so it's very dramatic. Butterfly weed is great because then you can attract monarch caterpillars. And then pickerel weed is one of those plants that likes to grow in wet soil. So it can handle soils that are inundated. And so if you're living on the edge of the bay or a pond, something like pickerel weed can be good. Plants for shady, drier spots. Sometimes these are tricky spots. Mist flower is, again, kind of weedy, but it's a native. It has these beautiful purple puffy flowers in the fall. It is happy in dry habitats. It's happy in some shade. There are lots of fern species that do well in shade. Mayapple is up right now. It's also a good spreading plant, so it doesn't get real tall, but it'll spread in the shade. And partridge berry is a good ground cover. It's really small, it's really low, but it's, I have partridge berry in my yard where nothing else grows. There's like moss and partridge berry. So it's good for shade and dry spots, basically. Shade with a little bit of moisture. Meadow beauty is gorgeous. I like meadow beauty a lot. And it grows well in wet spots. Cardinal flower does too. Cardinal flower is hummingbird pollinated. Lyre leaf sage, I put it on the shady wetter spot slide, but it can grow just about anywhere. It's blooming around now, and it's, low as a rosette most of the time, but when it blooms, it's taller. And then royal fern, because it's big and dramatic. So that gives you some ideas of things you can plant. If you go to the plant sale, there's a very extensive list that has lots of information about the habitats that those plants like, when they flower, so you can sort of maximize having something blooming all the time, and also what wildlife it's good for, and if it's deer resistant, which is good to know. All right, so I have just shown you a bunch of pictures of gorgeous native plants you can plant. Now I want to talk about why we plant native plants. And these are also ecological reasons that if you are planting natives, you are promoting a strong ecosystem. And the first reason to plant natives is because they're not invasive. I have a picture here of English ivy, which you might have some experience with. English ivy smothers ground cover, can climb trees and smother trees. It is not native. It was introduced, but it can escape cultivation and take over an area and outcompete the natives. So when I say do no harm, what I'm saying is don't plant something that's going to kill all the rest of the plants. It's going to smother them all. So it's important to keep an eye out for natives versus invasives and to avoid invasives. Invasive species can cause harm to the ecosystem by outcompeting things, but also by potentially adding toxins to the soil. This is garlic mustard, and garlic mustard actually suppresses the fungi in the soil that plants need. It doesn't need the fungus, and so it's really bad for soils and sort of degrades the soil, so it's harder for other plants to grow there. And some garden plants you can buy. So there are some garden plants that can be invasive and you can buy them, right? So you've got variegated yellow flag iris here in a catalog. You can order it and plant it in your yard, and then it's going to take over. And this illustration down here shows all the counties where it's been introduced in Virginia. And you can see that it's from here all the way up to Richmond. So you have to look out for potential invasives. The BLM has information on what's invasive, and also you can go to the Virginia DCR website, and they have a list of invasives and ways to identify them. Virginia Tech also has some good invasive websites. Some other problematic invasives you might run into include mimosa, which looks really pretty, but grows, wild on roadsides and self-propagates. Privet is a shrub that can be pretty invasive. Bamboo, just never plant bamboo. Just don't. It grows so rapidly and is so hard to remove once you plant it. This is a new invasive that we're starting to see in this area. It's lesser celandine. And here's a picture of it carpeting the ground in a Pennsylvania forest. It spreads really rapidly. It's sometimes planted as a garden plant, but it escapes cultivation very quickly. So you got to watch out for it. A couple more: porcelain berry, which is a vine, and then also periwinkle. It's common to see periwinkle because it's been planted a lot as a ground cover, but it'll escape cultivation. So planting natives means you're not damaging the ecosystem through invasive species. Another reason to plant natives is to improve ecosystem function. And I have a picture here of a rain garden. So it is an area where water collects, and when it rains, the water flows into that area, but the plants there are adapted to tolerate those wet soils. And so they help stabilize the soil, but they also help remove the moisture from the soil. So they are pulling it into their own tissues, they're transpiring it out into the world. So those native plants are an important part of the ecosystem and an important part of biogeochemical cycles. So they are very important for improving ecosystem function. And another key ecosystem function they play is supporting wildlife. Your yard is a habitat for animals. And the better habitat you have, the more animals you're going to support in your yard. Native plants support native animals. So invasive plants, usually less so. Even if they're not invasive, but they're horticultural varieties, often don't support our native insects that need particular native plants for food, or animals that are cued in to feed on the berries of native plants. Lots of animals eat plants, and that's not a bad thing. Caterpillars that turn into the butterflies you love are busy eating leaves on plants. Rabbits, which might be prey for the birds that you love, are busy eating plants. This is a beetle grub feeding on a root underground. So there's lots of soil organisms that are feeding on plants. So lots of animals eat plants, and they need those plants as their own food source. And it's okay because plants can defend themselves. Native plants have adaptations for native herbivores. Here's a thorn on a honey locust. And you can see that giant honey locust thorn. One of the possible explanations of why they're so big is that it was so the honey locust could defend itself against giant ground sloths, which have since gone extinct, but the honey locust is still around. So plants have physical defenses like this, and then plants also have chemical defenses. You might recognize the names of some of these compounds: caffeine, ephedrine, quinine, codeine, morphine, nicotine. Plants make these so that animals will not eat them. Nicotine is pretty toxic. So plants that make nicotine are much less likely to get eaten by herbivores. There may be some specialist herbivores that eat them, but in general, they're good at defending themselves. Also, native flowers support native pollinators, and planting natives supports bumblebee populations, butterfly populations, even things like flies that pollinate flowers. So planting native flowers means you get to see lovely pollinators in your yard, but it also means that you are helping those pollinator populations persist. Also, fruits and seeds support wildlife. So we've got some persimmon here, some pokeberry, some goldfinch eating a thistle. When you plant native plants, the wildlife in your yard will have something to eat, and they'll want to come hang out in your yard because that's where the food is. So that's another important ecosystem function that you're providing by supporting these animals. And then my last point is that reasons to plant natives have to do a little bit with ecological restoration. And I want to convince you that planting a few natives is a good thing. Maybe your yard is mostly grass, but if you cut out a little corner and you start planting natives, then you are helping to improve ecosystem function. You're helping to restore biodiversity. You don't have to move mountains. You don't have to do a ton all at once. You can just start with a little corner of your yard, put in a few natives that you think will be happy there, and see how they do. So this figure is a little complex, but I'll explain it. This describes ecosystems by their structure, which is the number of species they have on the x-axis, and then the function of the ecosystem on the y-axis, which we can measure through biomass, which is like the productivity, the amount of carbon that's being fixed by all those plants. And so a degraded ecosystem has low species richness and low ecosystem function. It doesn't have very many species. It doesn't have great function. I hate to break it to you, but that's a lawn. There's one species in there, very little ecosystem function. There's no animals living in there. There's no structure for birds to land on. So a lawn is kind of a degraded ecosystem. If you add more species, you are rehabilitating that ecosystem. You're heading towards restoring that ecosystem. Even if you're not adding very many species, you can increase ecosystem function. And often ecologists call that remediation, where your goal is not to restore what was there before, but rather just to improve ecosystem function, just to provide more habitat. So maybe you're planting things that aren't, traditionally native to your county, but are native to Virginia. That is still important for ecosystem function. So you could have a lawn, or you could have a bunch of native plants in your yard, which creates so many more interesting, exciting things. And that's my last point, to plant natives, because ecology is fascinating. If you have natives in your yard, you get hummingbirds pollinating them, and you get to watch monarch caterpillars develop, and you get to smell the sassafras and look at his crazy leaves. And there's just so many more things going on in your yard, and you get to enjoy all of those ecological dynamics and know that you're doing something important for ecosystem functioning and for biodiversity. So that's what I have. I'm happy to take questions. I'm sure you have a lot. Yes. That's a great question. So the question is, if you don't have a yard, but you have the ability to do some container gardening, what should you put in your containers? I think it would probably be very rewarding to plant things that pollinators like. My first thought is that you should plant something hummingbirds like. But that's, you can grow coral honeysuckle as a vine along your balcony, and that will attract hummingbirds. Definitely things like asters. Asters attract a wide variety of pollinators and don't usually have a particularly deep root system, so you should be able to grow them in planters. And, when you go to the plant sale, everything starts out in a pot. So if it's growing in a pot when you buy it, it's happy enough to be in a pot, and you could maybe size it up and give it a try. Yeah, that was a good question. And that can make a huge difference for pollinators and migrating hummingbirds and things like that, to have that little tiny patch of habitat. Yes. Uh-huh. So the question is about canna lilies, which are not native, but very popular with the hummingbirds. And my rule of thumb is usually, if it's not spreading, if it's not turning into invasive, it's established in your yard, it's not just lawn, I say keep it, but I tend to be moderate. Some people are, some people, are really headed for that ecological restoration function, but I have plant friends I like that aren't native. And so I like my camellia that blooms in winter. So, and especially if it's making the hummingbirds happy, it's certainly more natural than a hummingbird feeder is. So, yeah. Yes. Yeah. Okay. Yeah. Yeah. So the question is about having a low-lying area that's a ditch that drains a bunch of yards and then heads out into the bay. So my question is, how salty is it? Is this fresh water coming off people's yards, or is it a little bit salty because it's bay water? Uh-huh. Yeah. Yeah. Okay. So if it's mostly freshwater, you could try Hibiscus moschutos, this guy. Oh, I went too far. No, I didn't. Yeah, the swamp rose mallow, because it's a shrub, it gets pretty big, it has nice big leaves, so it's going to suck a lot of water out of the soil. And if it's standing water a lot of the time, you can do something like pickerel weed. And royal fern if it's shady, because royal fern likes to have its feet wet. Oh, and then cardinal flower. The royal fern can take a little bit of salt and the moschutos can take more. And then you could always go with groundsel tree or salt bush, which can handle a lot of salt, but gets kind of big. Yeah. Yes. Oh, that's a good question. So the question is, what native should you plant if you want to attract insects that are beneficial, that are potentially predatory on other insects? I think something in the aster family is good because it supports a lot of different insects, and that would be something like black-eyed Susan, native sunflower, asters. Those are going to attract pollinators. And then when those insects are present, that'll attract, predatory wasps because their prey is there. Yeah, and they bloom for a long time, which is good too. Yeah. Other questions? There might be questions from go ahead. Oh, tips for English ivy. Persistence. So, you can cut the vines, but then if you've got it on the ground, it's a lot of pulling. You could try the cardboard newspaper approach, where you just try and smother it with cardboard and newspaper. I mean, it's not very attractive. You can put mulch on top of it. Yeah. 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 Right. Exactly. It's definitely something you have to stay on top of. Yeah. I have seen places where people have successfully eradicated it. So it's doable. But yes, persistence. Oh. Yeah. Right. So the question is whether you should check your soil. And that's a great idea. You can get a box, mix up some soil from your yard in it, mail it to Virginia Tech, and they will tell you about the health of your soil and make recommendations for amending it if you need to. That can be really helpful if you haven't been gardening in that place for very long, if you think that maybe it's, construction, fill dirt, and you just want to know what's going on in there. If you have some place where you've been gardening a long time, it could give you an idea of what nutrients you need to add. But yeah, if you want to learn more, that's a good way to do it, because soil pH can really vary, and some plants are adapted to more acidic soils, things like that. Yes. Oh, so is there something you can do about poison ivy that has made it all the way up a tree? So poison ivy is native, so you don't have to do anything. Makes berries, supports the wildlife. If it's going up a tree, you can just cut a chunk out of the stem as it goes up the tree, and that will kill it all the rest of the way up, because that stem that connects it to the soil is necessary to move water up to the top of the plant. So if you cut the vine as it's going up the tree, then it should kill everything above that. How long does the poison stay on your equipment? That's also a good question. It depends on how sensitive you are. I have used rubbing alcohol to wipe down equipment to neutralize the oils. So certainly cleaning your equipment using rubbing alcohol on it can help suppress, can help remove some of the oils that would make your skin irritated. And you know about Technu? Oh, Technu is a product you can buy at the drugstore that you can put on either before you're exposed to poison ivy that creates a barrier, or you can use as soap after you've been exposed to poison ivy to help remove the oils. Yeah. 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 TECNU, Technu. So it's useful. Yeah. Yeah. Right. Yeah. So what do you put down when you don't want grass, but you want to not take over the whole neighborhood? So it depends a little bit on how vertical you want it to be. Things like blue-eyed grass look a lot like grass, but are native. There are some native grasses people plant as ground cover. If you have a very shady spot that's not too dry, you might be able to maintain a moss lawn, which I think is kind of a lot of work, but looks really cool. Yeah, and partridge berry is another good low ground cover that's not an aggressive spreader. But if you get something that's not an aggressive spreader, it's going to take a while to fill in your yard. So yeah, but you know, try some things out. Pick the plants that look good to you and plant them and see who wins. Yes. Yeah. Yeah. So what happens? Right. So if you have a lawn and you're not maintaining it, or you're mowing it periodically but not weeding it, you're definitely going to get things in there, some of which will be native and some won't be. I think it's really pretty when a lawn blooms, you know, especially in the spring. Yeah. It's, yeah, I think that's a good step towards do no harm. I think that you might end up favoring some invasive species if you truly don't do anything. But a lot of our lawn weeds, especially if you mow, are winter annuals and bloom in the spring. You could put down pre-emergent herbicide, which is really just a plant hormone that suppresses germination. So if you put down, yeah, good. Is there an online question? Good question. Okay, so other than here, where else can you buy native plants? There are some native plant nurseries around. The Virginia Native Plant Society keeps a list of nurseries and often has advertisements for plant sales. So the Virginia Native Plant Society website has a good list of places to go for that sort of thing. And often master gardeners and master naturalists have plant sales. I feel like one of the best ways to stay sort of tapped in is to start joining some of those groups on Facebook, or talk to a friend who's a master naturalist and ask them when they have a sale. Sort of keep your eye out. This is the time of year for native plant sales. So yes. Okay, yeah, so native plant sale in Williamsburg next weekend. If you, the master gardeners, which is and master naturalists, I think also are programs run through the extension service, and they are pretty organized. I'm sure there's a web page somewhere advertising whatever plant sales they have. Yeah. Yeah, so some master gardeners, the Newport News area master gardeners seem to be pretty invested in natives, but not all master gardener groups are. And sometimes the plants that end up at the plant sale are the things people have dug out of their yard because they've spread so much. So you got to be careful with that. Any other online questions? Yeah. Virginia creeper is native, and maybe the side of your house, if it's going to pull out masonry or something like that, would be bad because it does have those little suckers. But it's native and shouldn't bother trees. Same with grapevines. That yeah, I can't think of a native vine that can really smother a tree. Yeah. Yeah, Marcus. Ah, that's a good question. So if you have an HOA, you live in a neighborhood where native plants are not particularly popular or accepted, I would start with using native plants in what looks like a more traditional garden bed. You know, so if you've got your little garden bed in front of your house, put a beautyberry shrub in there, right? And that's native, but it looks like, you know, landscaping. So if you choose natives that look like landscaping, and then you can, like, you know, make your bed a little bigger and get a little further out into your lawn, and, you know, just sort of baby steps. And there are some HOAs who are totally open to the idea of natives. A lot of it is communication, you know, and that sort of thing. And often you can sell the idea of natives with, it takes less water, it takes less fertilizer, it's going to help us with our runoff problem. things like that. Yes. Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yeah. So mhm. Yeah, that's a good question. So if you let your lawn go, what invasives should you still be kind of out there looking out for? A lot of lawn weeds are not very competitive in habitats that aren't mowed. So they aren't likely to escape into a big natural area. They may suppress the growth of natives. I'm trying to think if there's anything that feel like I don't know of any lawn weeds that are on like the truly toxic list, you know, that if it's growing in your lawn, you know, not great, but it's also, I can't think of any that are classified as being particularly damaging. Yeah. Yeah. Yes. Ah. Yeah, it's kind of a discreet little plant. Where did my lesser celandine go? Yeah. Yeah. It I feel like if you don't have very much of it, just pulling it, digging it out, pulling it, and every time you see it, you got to pull it again, and eventually you'll knock it back. Yeah. Mm-hmm. Oh, no, I bet. Well, actually, I don't know what it does from the root level. My guess is that you could certainly try smothering it. And then also don't let it go to seed. So even if you can't dig it all out, maybe weed whack it so it's not making seeds. Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yes. Mm-hmm. Ooh, that's a good question. So it looks a little bit like green and gold. It also looks a whole lot like marsh marigold. So you really have to look at the leaves and look at the texture of the leaves, which is different than marsh marigold. Also, I don't think green and gold has quite the same flower, but I'm not remembering its flower particularly well. Oh, okay. Yeah. And so the lesser celandine has a lot more than 5 petals. So that's another way to tell it. Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's tricky. The uh iNaturalist website is a good place to go when you're looking for plant ID, and their Seek app will let you take a picture of something and figure out what it is. So that's very useful. It's Seek, SEEK. So it's, you know, you can hold your phone camera up to it and sort of let the app take a look at it, and then it will give you an ID for it. Yeah. Mm-hmm. Yes. Oh. Okay. Okay. So the point is that the lesser celandine has little bulbs. And so you have to make sure when you're digging it out that you get those bulbs. If you don't, then those bulbs are going to spread and propagate. So it's a tricky one. Yes. Yeah. And so it's from iNaturalist, and you yeah, and the app is Seek, SEEK, and it's really useful. It's free. It will connect to iNaturalist if you want to start recording your observations. Yeah. Yes. Oh, that's a good question. So if you had, if you want to keep the rabbits out of your garden, what do you give them to eat? They do like little new green shoots on a lot of things, but I actually think you might be best off with a little fence. Raised beds, a fence, just a physical barrier for rabbits often is the best thing. You got to be careful with netting because you get black snakes tied up in it, and that's bad. Oh, yeah. Yeah. I've heard people say that you should just plant more of it so you can share with the birds, but that's kind of a lot of work. All right. Yes. Oh, how long before a plant becomes native? Another good question. So generally we define native as having been here pre-white settlement. So if it was introduced with white settlement or after white settlement, it's considered not native. And it's invasive if it spreads aggressively and damages ecosystems. So there are things that are not native that aren't necessarily invasive. And there are also things that are native that are kind of aggressive spreaders. If you've ever planted obedient plant in your yard, Physostegia, it's native, but it spreads. So yeah. And in Europe, they don't have the same baseline. So their landscapes, like when they preserve a landscape, it's very different. Yeah. Maybe, I feel like it doesn't do well where you're not mowing though, right? So, right. I don't know if it counts. Right. Yeah, right, exactly. And it may be that it was initially introduced to be part of your yard. I've heard that like in the 40s and 50s, having clover in your yard was considered to be an attractive, healthy yard. But then when herbicides that killed all broadleaf things were introduced, the garden lawn people convinced us that we didn't want clover. So they could kill it with their broadleaf herbicide. So yeah. Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think clover in your yard is not anything to worry about. It's not like you go in the woods and see clover everywhere. Mm-hmm. Good. Well, thank you all. This has been fun. You guys have great questions. Yeah. You're welcome. It's my pleasure.
Yes, thank you guys so much. Thank you for sitting through bad audio. I'm always learning how to be an AV person. But I want to thank you guys for coming tonight. Thank you so much, Dr. Stephen, for joining us. Please come back this weekend for our native plant sale. And we will have our next Naturally Speaking event the next third Thursday of the month in May. We're going to have Dr. Adam Pritchard from the Virginia Museum of Natural History. He's going to talk a lot about his research and talk specifically about his work with us about our mastodon remains. So we hope to see you guys back next month. Thanks so much. Have a great night.